Back live with you tonight here on In Focus. The NPA has withdrawn rape charges against 14 suspects in the Krugersdorp gang rape case due to insufficient evidence. However, the suspects still face charges of contravening the Immigration Act. The prosecuting authority says although the suspects were positively identified, their DNA samples could not match those tested. In July, a group of men pounced on a film crew that was shooting a music video, and 8 women were gang raped. Meanwhile, a former police officer, Dolphina Trutter, faces charges of theft and defeating the ends of justice after she was found in possession of stolen items belonging to the victims. Joining us now to give her perspective on police investigations and the use of DNA testing as evidence is Dr. Vannessa Lynch, the regional leader of DNA for Africa. Dr. Vannessa, good to have you once again tonight on Newsroom Africa, and thank you for your time. So, is it something that is familiar or happens quite often in our justice system where there could be positive identification by the victim but failure to link DNA?
Good evening. Yes, absolutely. And we must remember that DNA is as important to identify somebody as it is to exonerate somebody. And it's often shown that eyewitness testimony is actually not that accurate, and whereas DNA evidence is. I'm not exactly sure why the DNA evidence didn't link these particular perpetrators. Sometimes the samples in some cases are mixed samples, and it becomes difficult to determine whose profile is in that particular sample. But I think in this particular case, there was no identification linked to the DNA evidence samples that were taken from the suspects, in which case it's an absolute exclusion if there is no match. Even if one of those alleles don't match, it is an exclusion. So it does show that the perpetrators are probably still out there if the DNA evidence hasn't linked them.
How do you get to that exclusion? I mean, does the fact that we have both samples and there is no need to go to a database somewhere and check whether there is a link and so on and so forth immediately excludes those particular 14 individuals?
Well, there's two aspects. The first is, does the reference sample taken from the suspect match the crime scene sample in that particular case? And in this case, it seems like the samples that were taken from the rape survivors, which were not linked, so you'll have a reference sample from the rape survivor, and then you'll have an unknown sample that is found on the rape survivor. And if that profile doesn't match that of the suspect, then there's no link to that particular suspect in respect of DNA, that is. But they could still put that profile on the DNA database, and that profile could still be linked to other unrelated cases, which in this case, obviously, it wasn't. Otherwise, they may have been arrested for another unrelated case. So it does seem that in terms of DNA, that the evidence found on these survivors is not linked to that particular perpetrator. Again, I don't know the facts of the case, only that DNA evidence in this instance linked those particular suspects. But it's not to say that obviously the suspects are still out there, and DNA evidence may still link the correct people to that particular crime.
Could there be a situation where the DNA collected from the victim becomes contaminated to a point where it's impossible then to link it to whoever the perpetrator that would have been arrested?
Well, you must remember that DNA evidence is biological evidence, and there are lots of reasons why there could be degradation of that particular evidence. It could be that not enough DNA was taken. Maybe there was saliva, for instance, but it might have dried and there wasn't enough of that sample to actually get a full profile. It might have been contaminated for whatever purpose while it was being taken. It might have degraded if not stored correctly. So there are a number of reasons why that could happen. I don't know, again, if this was the case or if the evidence that they did collect, they do actually have good profiles, but the profiles are not linked to these particular suspects. So unless we really have the facts of the case, we can't say in this instance what occurred. But yes, there are a number of reasons that could occur with regards to not having a good sample, such as you say, contamination, which confuses the issue because now you have a number of different profiles in a sample, or degradation where you don't have a full profile that could possibly link to a perpetrator.
as you say, I mean, we're not quite sure what the process is that was followed and what has happened now. But is it possible to then maybe even run the DNA that they have? Yes, they couldn't link it to the 14, but run it through their database, and it could link to somebody else that is in the database.
Absolutely, and this is why our database is so important, because, we've seen cases, and I've spoken about this to yourself before, where
Yes.
You have an arrestee who may have been arrested for an unrelated case, a common assault, and they could be linked to 30 different rapes. So in this instance, if they had taken a good reference sample, which they presumably would have from these 14 suspects, and entered those profiles onto the database, which they definitely would have done, because in terms of our law, we are able to do that. It doesn't seem like they have linked it to other cases, but perhaps they have, and we haven't yet heard about that. But if these perpetrators had committed a crime and they had collected DNA evidence in respect of those other crimes, then absolutely those profiles would be linked. So, perhaps that's something that may still come out. But in this particular case, when they compared these profiles to those of the crime scene samples taken from the rape survivors, it appears as if, without knowing the full facts of the case, that there was no link to the DNA evidence to these perpetrators, to these suspects.
The NPA says that we can't really blame the victims because they were traumatized and scared at the time because they had just been raped. So it could be that the identity parade could have been affected by that. But does that then go on to emphasize the importance of what you've just said, that eyewitness testimony needs to be linked to something else? In this particular case, needs to be linked to DNA. So you could have the identity parade, but the identity parade on its own might not make a strong case.
Well, I don't think any evidence on its own is necessarily strong. I think all forms of evidence are important. Eyewitness testimony has been shown in the past to not be as accurate or reliable because of various factors that can often influence a person's recollection of a particular crime, for sure. DNA evidence, it doesn't have those issues because it either is or it isn't a person's DNA, or it either is or isn't linked to that particular case. But DNA is also not the only evidence, and there would be other forms of evidence that could perhaps be trace evidence, for instance, or fingerprint evidence. All of those are still important aspects of evidence. So we hope that the NPA has different forms of evidence, but in this particular case, it seems that the DNA evidence that they had analyzed was not linked. But it's not to say that there isn't other evidence that could possibly help them build a case against the suspects and hopefully find them soon. But in this case, DNA evidence didn't link these particular suspects, which is why probably they were released.
Explore this fact for me. Men wearing blankets and balaclavas, they are joined by other men, and it's a gang rape. It's multiple rapes. It's multiple individuals. Is it possible to be able to isolate that kind of DNA?
Mixed samples, there are algorithms that are able to differentiate between profiles in a mixed sample. This kind of differentiation is available, the software. Whether in South Africa we have it yet, I don't know, but the scientists that are working on this do have the capacity and the capabilities to interpret, and it will still be relevant even if they don't have a good single source profile. They'll still be able to use that in conjunction with other forms of evidence. So even in mixed samples, which we see in some cases, they do still lead that as evidence, and in collaboration with other forms of evidence, it does still have some value. Again, without knowing the facts of this case, I don't know whether they even have that, whether we're talking about mixed samples or a complete exclusion, where no aspect of that particular DNA profile has been linked to the crime scene evidence found on the rape survivors. I think in the next few days, perhaps we will have a statement by the police where they are able to clarify that, or perhaps we'll be able to have access to the dockets or the court documents where we'll be able to understand why they were released with regards to the DNA evidence.
Yeah. Does this mean then it's back to square one for the police? I mean, they've arrested a number of people on the Immigration Act. Do you think then they would need to run those samples with the rest of the people that they would have arrested?
Well, I think that it's an ongoing investigation. Clearly, the perpetrators appear to still be out there, and it doesn't mean that the case is closed or that's the end of the road. If they've got good evidence and they've got DNA evidence from the rape survivors, then absolutely there's a good chance that they will continue to arrest people. But it also shows that if these weren't actually the perpetrators, that the eyewitness testimony would have actually led them possibly to a conviction. And if they're innocent, that would be a terrible tragedy. So, in fact, if DNA evidence actually leads them to the correct perpetrators ultimately, then it just shows that really we should be relying on it more and more if it is that accurate and that valuable in investigations. So we mustn't lose sight of the fact that it can exonerate as well as identify perpetrators. And possibly, releasing innocent people is far more important than actually identifying guilty people, which I'm sure most people would agree with.
I suppose then also this goes on to highlight the importance that many activists and many organizations have been raising around the availability of DNA kits at police stations to allow women who are victims of gender-based violence and assaults to be able to identify, I suppose, those who have perpetrated such crimes upon them.
Well, there's amazing work being done by the NPA and the Tuteleza Care Centres, the TCC centres, which are sort of known as one-stop centres where rape survivors can go to. They do have sexual assault kits available. The police are working in collaboration with those centres. There are a lot more of these opening throughout South Africa, and they really are getting to a point where there is accessibility for rape survivors to be able to go to these care centres in order to be able, first of all, to be the welfare of the survivor is of utmost importance, and then the collection of that evidence is actually really up to the survivor. Only if they elect to have evidence collected will it be done. And then the police will obviously collect that and take it to the laboratory. And all of these systems do seem to be in place. Kits are available. The backlog is probably our biggest issue. In this case, it was obviously prioritized because of the nature and the nature of this particular crime. But the backlog, obviously, for other rape survivors who are at the back of the line, those perpetrators are still going to go out there, no doubt repeat offenders. And this is something that we need to address more urgently. We need more capacity in this country. We need to be taking samples from convicted offenders. We need to look at public-private partnerships in order to increase capacity so that we can reduce that backlog and identify these perpetrators earlier. Possibly if we hadn't have such a big backlog, we could even find that these perpetrators that are guilty of this gang rape might even have perpetrated rape beforehand, and their samples might even be in that backlog. So it just shows how important it is to get through that.
That's particularly true because the communities said this has actually been an occurrence that happens quite regularly. It just the one of the 8 women became so highlighted and became publicly known, but they were saying that there are such instances that have occurred previously. In fact, that whole community was saying we live in fear. And so I'm saying it could be correct that those samples are already somewhere in the police station in this particular backlog and they have not been processed.
Absolutely. And this is why it's so important. The early identification of rapists actually prevents tomorrow's victims. And this is something we keep saying about the backlog, is that rapists are not once-off offenders. They actually are repeat offenders. And just as this community is saying, there is no doubt that these offenders have probably offended previously. And no doubt if we actually were getting through our backlog, we probably will find a number of them already in the system. And had they been identified, we possibly could have removed them from society and prevented this from happening again. So it really is of the utmost importance to continue to put pressure on the government, albeit they are doing everything that they possibly can, to continue to do everything in their power to reduce that backlog and ensure that DNA evidence is timeously collected and analyzed.
Dr. Vannessa Lynch, once again, appreciate it. Thank you so much for coming on tonight.